All right, everybody. So, I want to bring you a video on my anti-Xeno Type-10 build, which I just finished. It's a cold and shielded hybrid build that, it does make some concessions to achieve that, but there's a couple things I want to warn you about before we go any further. First, this build requires some heavy engineering. A lot of things must be fully engineered, and if you're planning to copy my build, there's some very specific engineering, like experimentals that have to be undone to make this work. And if you're planning to tweak this build a bit, I really highly recommend you double check everything in heatsink first to make sure it's going to work, because this build is pretty min-maxed. With my final power rating setup, I'm at 99.8% power usage. That's without even the frame shift drive turned off. Now, the second thing is I actually haven't tested this build yet. I haven't had time to, but I will be playing this build tomorrow on stream. So if you want to come catch that tomorrow, either live, or you can just watch the VOD afterwards. Once that stream is done and out, I will link it below this video so you can go see how this build plays for yourself. And I guess there is one other thing that's kind of like the main point of this build was actually just sort of testing the concept of hybrid builds and like kind of how viable that is. So just keep that in mind, but that's all I want to say. So let's go ahead and get into it. Now let's get started with the hard points. Now I do want to go ahead and say this is actually not the set of hard points I intend to use. It's simply what I could use, right? I planned this build out to use any set of experimental weapons that I want, and the way I planned for this was I planned for 6 modified plasma chargers and 1 class 2 beam laser and 2 class 1 beam lasers in case I wanted to use that many, right? And this is pretty much the most power draw I'm ever going to have in this build. Now, I don't actually have 6 modified plasma chargers, I only have 4. So, I've put in these modified shard cannons to fill that in. They only draw a little bit less, but you get the idea. You can run any 6 experimental weapons you want, pretty much, right? Except for the class 3 plasma chargers. The unmodified class 3 plasma chargers draw a little bit more power than the modified class 2s, but just keep that in mind if you want to run those. But me personally, I'm never planning to run those. I'm not worried about it. And that's pretty much it for the hard points. So you can run whatever you want here. If you run my build pretty much 1-for-1, again, it's set for class 3 plasma chargers. Just keep that in mind. Alright, so getting started with the core internals, pretty much everything here is pretty standard except for the power plant, right? So let's go over everything else first, just so you know. Heavy duty, deep plating, holes, armor, dirty drive, drag drives, thrusters. FSD is whatever you want. Obviously, FSD range mass manager being as obvious. Lightweight life support. I do run charge enhanced. If you really wanted to, I guess you could run weapons focused, but because this build does have shields, I decided to go with charge enhanced and obviously super conduits, sensors, long range sensors, and the fuel tank is whatever. Now getting to the power plant. Now this is again where it starts getting a little non-standard. Now I'm running an armored power plant with the monster experimental. Depending on what you want to run on your build, for example, if you know you're not going to be running as heavy power draw weapons as I'm planning to be able to run, you could probably maybe get away with running thermal spread here. But again, make sure you check that in EDC before you actually try it out. And keep in mind, this has room for micro optimizations for your own personal build. Just keep that in mind. And that's pretty much all there is to talk about in terms of the core internals. Just remember that this power plant basically has to be fully, grade 5 armored and monstered if you want to follow my setup 1-to-1. And honestly, if you want to, even for any setup at all, you're going to need a grade 5 armored power plant. And now let's go ahead and move on. Now, looking at the optional internals, we have something pretty out of the standard right away with the bi-leaf shield generator. And this shield generator is engineered with enhanced low power shields and low draw. Now, both of these are pretty mandatory. You really have to cut down the power on their shield to get it to fit. But you might be worried about the amount of, shielding you're going to get. But you actually turned out with a pretty good amount of shields. With my setup, I end up with 1,000 shields roundabouts, which is, pretty decent. And considering these shields are primarily intended just to be like a sort of regenerating buffer and not necessarily meant to be like your primary form of defense, this is just a nice little extra buffer for when, you're getting, pelted by scouts, or you catch a stray volley of interceptor fire, right? Not really intended to be your main defense, but unfortunately, both of these are pretty necessary to make it fit. And because as you see, with enhanced low power and low draw, we end up reducing the power draw by 52%. Pretty good. Now, dual stew technically end up with, about the same baseline strength, right? So pretty good overall. Now moving on, everything else is pretty standard. You got the whole reinforcements, obviously heavy duty deep plating, your experimental weapon stabilizer, of course. Now getting into the module reinforcements, there's something to mention here. This build can only fit a single class 2 Guardian module reinforcement. You can't fit any more than that. You can't even fit an extra class 1 Guardian module. By the way, you can replace this auto docking computer if you're less lazy than I am with just a regular old module reinforcement. But just keep that in mind. If you want to copy my build 1-for-1, you can only have a single 2D Guardian module reinforcement. And that's pretty much all there is to talk about in terms of the optionals. Let's talk about kind of what makes all of this end up working and where you're going to need some more specific stuff in the utility mounts. So looking at the utility mounts, first we've got 2 shield boosters, both heavy duty super capacitors. It's very important these are engineered. We're really trying to squeeze as much shielding out of as few slots as we can. But you're really going to want these, as good as you can get them. Now moving on, we've got 4 of the pre-engineered heat sinks, and you can actually run 5 of these if you don't need the Xeno scanner, but these pre-engineered heat sinks are kind of the crux of this, right? Now that we have these, these double engineered heat sinks that have that, they hold 5 heat sinks each. They're more efficient than regular engineered heat sinks, obviously, and effectively, these 4 heat sinks would be 5 of the regular engineered heat sinks, right? And it's kind of the crux of how this works, right? This way we can manage to get enough heat sinks for it to work while also having enough shielding, right? So just keep that in mind. Again, if you don't need a Xeno scanner, you're not running like, multi-cannons or something, you can take this off and run an extra pre-engineered heat sink. That'll get you up to 30 total heat sinks, or 25 total heat sinks, from the 20 here we have here. And then finally, we have the field neutralizer. Of course, this is pretty mandatory these days, especially in the combat zones. You're going to need that field neutralizer. But again, make sure you've got these shield boosters. Make sure they're fully engineered, because you really, really need to get as much shielding as you can for as little investment as possible, right? And that's going to be pretty much it for this build. Now, again, just a couple reminders. If you're planning to change anything about this build, make sure you double check everything in EDC first to make sure it's going to work out. Because, it took quite a lot of tweaking just to get this build working out together. And, in your case, you may not need to run a monstered armor powered plant. You may be able to run armored thermal spread. Or, you may be able to run slightly more shielding. You might not have to run low draw or something, right? If you're planning to run like multi-cannons or something, right? So just keep that in mind. Just double check everything in EDC and enjoy. I really hope this build does turn out to be pretty good. I think it'll be pretty fun, even if it isn't particularly optimal. And I think the big takeaway from this build is the kind of same principles can be applied to, well, better ships, right? And, go for a nice hybrid, comfy, but also can deal with hydras effectively. So yeah, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you in the next one. Till then, take it easy and have a good one, everybody.